are now responsible for the state of the whole planet. Our farming practices, our expansion, our industrial revolution have led us into this. And we have the technology to control what happens next. But we're just not up to the job. As successful hunter-gatherers, we evolved to be clever enough, but not disinterested enough, not insightful enough, nor cooperative enough. It's very frightening to find that one has created a situation that one can't control. So our species can't control what it's unleashed. And whether we admit it or not, we are terrified. We feel helpless. Terrified, helpless people take refuge in denial. And denial makes us ever more greedy and reckless. And the planet groans under the burden of our suicidal pursuits. It's like there's a continuous bass note sounding like the drone of a bagpipe, and however frenetically we're playing our current theme tunes, we can't drown out that note. And that bass note is the sound of melting ice caps, mass species extinctions, seas filled with plastic, felled rainforests, lost habitats, and unbreathable air. Of course, we know all that, but we can't look at it. You can't go around all the time remembering that every cup of coffee you drink, every journey you make, every fire you sit by, every meal you eat is contributing to the end of our world. You have to stay sane, after all. But what is sane? Is it sane to think we are the center of our world? If everything out there is just a reflection of our own needs and our own fantasies, then it could feel as if we're in control of it. The faster we hurtle towards environmental and economic collapse, the more the narcissists hold sway. That bass note of warning doesn't trouble anybody who's chanting their own slogan loudly enough. Standing up for our future means transforming our notions of where we stand. It means taking less for ourselves instead of more. It means listening to the people who are already suffering the effects of pollution and climate change, and who mostly live in societies that didn't cause it, and honouring their rights instead of colluding with their dispossession. It actually means going against the whole tenor of the society in which we live. So how on earth do we do that? A worthy Victorian had endowed my school with an annual lecture. It was called The Moral Progress of the World During the Preceding 12 Months. The lecture of 1965 forever changed my awareness of the planet I lived on. The clergyman lecturer began, "I can't talk about the moral progress of the world during the preceding 12 months because there has been none. There never has been. Instead, I'm going to tell you about what's happening to the world you live in." He was the first person to tell me the story of destruction, loss of habitat, and ensuing injustices. He told us how our society was bringing everything to the brink of extinction. He told us the end of the story was up to us, the next generation. Well, that seemed pretty unfair. After all, it wasn't our fault what happened before we were born. So I and the others had to change things. I took the injunction quite seriously. Recently, I heard Marge Piercy talk about the 1970s and 80s, through which I also lived. "We thought we were going to change the world," she said, and then her voice broke a little. "It was so great," she added. Well, she was right. I too was young, and we knew we had to change the world. The women's movement, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, CND, Greenham Common, direct action, indirect action. Our story was all about the possibility of change. And one phrase has stayed with me: revolution by change of consciousness. But however revolutionary our theme tune, that mournful bass note never went away. Was our story of crisis all a crazy hippie delusion? It was quite correct about the urgent need for change. The symptoms of decline are now all around us. So why did the story we told then not speak loudly enough to power? Maybe we need to be more truthful about what's happening. The true story of our times goes more like this: we aren't capable of reparation any more than Canute could stop the tide coming in. The true story of our times goes: there is a huge wave already breaking over us, and nothing in our technology or collective wisdom can stop it. We cannot now change what is happening. And we can't drown out that bass note, the sound of our planet's pain. We could tune into it instead. Perhaps it's telling us the very story we've been looking for all along. No wonder we're so frightened of listening to it. We're going to have to let go of all those other tunes to hear it properly. But aren't you curious as well? What's going to happen next? If this is where the real story is, don't you want to hear what it says? It's worth attending to people who've been listening to other stories all the time. Take the hunter-gatherers who once lived here in Scotland. They hardly changed their environment in 7,000 years. Their society was no Eden, but it was almost certainly egalitarian, and its people were attuned to the world around them in a way that we can only dream of. Hunter-gatherer societies produce go-betweens, or shamans, if you like, who are the people who listen best. Certain individuals were, and are, born with a sensitivity which is recognized by others, and it is their job to speak to the animals about the hunt. In The Other Side of Eden, Hugh Brody speaks about the terrible bargain that every one of us makes when we come into the world. In order that we may live, something else must die. This is the bargain the go-betweens make with the animals about the hunt. The animals agree because the bargain allows the natural balance which always maintains the rightness of things. We have come so far from our distant past that most of us would probably survive in a hunter-gatherer society for less than a week without wiser people to look after us. All the more reason to look humbly at human societies in which people interact with the earth, the seasons, the animals and plants. We can never return to that seamless sense of belonging which our distant ancestors possessed, and just a few people in marginal places, marginal to agriculture and industry that is, on this earth still possess. We know too much, and there are far too many of us. We can't go back. The world that lies ahead is going to be very different, but it seems to me that everything begins to go wrong when we stop listening and we stop speaking with the animals about the hunt. That terrible bargain that we survive by the death of other beings has never gone away. I've heard people talk about the post-agricultural age, that we are now even post-industrial and firmly in the digital age. And I think, what did you have for dinner? In Greenland, I came across a phrase used by the Inuit. The people say to a newborn child or a stranger living among them, "You will always find food here." That promise of survival is a vital part of the story, and it can only be honoured by people who remember the terrible bargain, and how it can only be kept by maintaining the balance between our needs and the equally important needs of the animals and of the land. So who do we have in our global community who is listening to that story? They're the go-betweens we need, whose voices we need to hear. Poets, for a start. It was two poets who started the Dark Mountain Project, which exists as an internet-based community of those who try to find voices for our times. We are facing unimaginable changes. Therefore, the first thing we need is people who can imagine them. Nothing is worse than the unimaginable. We can't even begin to look at it. I couldn't imagine what went on in a chemotherapy ward until I spent time there accompanying a friend. The unimaginable turned into something known, which encompassed death and despair, as well as life and hope. But once I'd been there myself, the nightmare of the unimaginable dissolved. Now I'm a bit more empowered and a bit more useful. Nothing is wholly unimaginable. And if the human mind can imagine something, it will inevitably find a way to represent it. Imagining the unimaginable takes courage. Not all endings are happy. Some characters will be dead at the end of Act 1. Imagine being one of them. It's worth the effort. Every time you do, your story will be freer from the dead weight of denial. There are people among us who can't handle their own awareness of other beings because it's too much to bear. That endless bass note of something going horribly wrong with our world sounds loudest to those most sensitively attuned to what it says. If we really want to know what that bass note means, we should maybe ask the people who can feel what's happening and who just cannot, by their nature, participate in the dance to destruction. My grandson can't cope with crowds, bright lights, loud shouts, quick changes, competition in any form. School education is impossible for him. He's distressed by a wasp drowning in a cup of coffee. He asks all the time, but why do they have wars? Why do they kill children? Why are they cutting down the trees? Why do they kill the animals? He keeps asking the same questions, not because he is in the least stupid, but because no one has yet answered them properly. He has met Bushmen in Namibia, where his father worked, and stayed in a traditional village. Now he often asks, what would the Bushmen do if a boy was being bullied? What would the Bushmen do if bombs were dropped there? I think he will be asking the same questions all his life. Some people care so much, they'll put their lives on the line to save what they love. We need them as much as ever, and sometimes activism succeeds. If a rainforest is saved, or one oak tree in a British field, if an ocean is reprieved, or one species of stickleback in a suburban pond, there is cause for celebration. But until the human species chooses to dance to a different piping altogether, that bass note will still sound. We'll still be heading the wrong way. So, how do we turn ourselves around? Standing up for mere survival is not enough. That always means our survival, made possible by having eliminated most of the other guys. Maybe it's time to think harder about our side of the bargain. Speaking with the animals about the hunt is not a concept familiar to our culture, but unless we empathize with those lives so utterly unlike our own and use that awareness wisely, there'll be nothing left to eat or breathe, and the story will end. Our story may end in any case. It's possible that we'll turn the page and see the words, "The end." Everything has to be imagined in this story, including that. Especially that, in fact, because denial begins with not facing one's own death. And as individuals, we will quite certainly get to the page that says, "The end." If we want a new beginning, we have to change our awareness. Guilt and regret are old stories. They only lead us backwards. What we need now is what Pandora found at the bottom of the box: hope. We need to read the signs of hope and encourage these new shoots in any way we can. In his new film, An Inconvenient Sequel, Al Gore quotes Martin Luther King. When the struggle for civil rights seemed to go on and on and on, and nothing seemed to change, people began to ask, how long must we struggle against these impossible, entrenched odds? Martin Luther King said, "Not long." He was right. The tipping point was close, but he didn't live to see it. This is what the animals say to the go-betweens about the hunt. They say that some of them agree to give themselves because in order for there to be life, there must be death. The tipping point that we dread may also be a transformation. If the dinosaurs still walk the earth, probably none of us would be here with our warm blood and our hearts and minds and our capacity to adapt to what is happening. There is hope in seeing where consciousness has already changed, whether it's manifested in alternative energy sources, saved species, or poetry. Worrying about whether we personally will survive into an uncertain future won't give us hope. Hope is in the present. It's the way we see things right here, right now. It's tuning into that bass note of the planet's pain, and instead of blocking our ears out of sheer terror for our own survival, listening as carefully as we possibly can, we can respond with whatever form of healing we're capable of. Our efforts may seem like a drop in the ocean, but as part of a great current, they're much more. We can't now prevent what we've unleashed, but we can face the consequences with more truth, better courage, and more grace. If we listen to the animals and to the earth itself, we'll start to hear what we need to do. Most certainly, the planet will survive, and out of whatever mayhem we have created, undreamed of life may come.